She fell in love with the wrong man and had to destroy him.
The wall clock showed almost 9 at night, but the cold lights of the office still burned over endless piles of paperwork. The tall windows reflected the illuminated city outside, a sea of buildings and headlights that felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. Inside, the silence was dense, broken only by the rhythmic click of Rachel's heels as she walked down the hallway. Each step echoed like a reminder. She was always the last to leave, the most dedicated, the one who went beyond what was necessary, and yet she remained invisible to those who decided the promotions. Rachel was 29 and had an impeccable resume, built from nights of study, exhausting internships, and a determination many mistook for coldness. But behind the tailored suits and steady gaze was a tired young woman. Her colleagues saw her as a promise of success, someone who would soon have her own office. But Rachel felt trapped in a gear that spun aimlessly. With every contract reviewed, every case won for clients she barely knew, the feeling grew inside her that she was living a life she hadn't chosen. She sat at her desk, the blue glow of the monitor illuminating her pale face. Her hands typed mechanically, but her mind wandered. She remembered when she was still a student, sitting in the public library with a cold coffee at her side and a stack of civil law books. She had promised herself she would never depend on anyone, that she would build a respected name. Back then, that promise was a beacon. Now it felt like a chain. She looked around. The empty desks, the artificial plants, the smell of paper and reheated coffee. This was her achievement. And yet inside she felt increasingly suffocated. She knew she was talented, that she had potential for something bigger. A landmark case, a unique opportunity, a chance to step into the circle of those who truly held power. But that chance never came. Her bosses praised her but handed the prestigious cases to older, better-connected attorneys. She was too good to be let go, but not important enough to be promoted. The pen twirled nervously between her fingers. The ticking of the clock seemed louder. This isn't what I fought so hard for, she thought. That phrase, repeated in silence, had become a kind of mantra. It was what kept her awake, what made her arrive early and leave late, hoping that someday someone would notice her. Outside, the city pulsed. There was life, music, laughter, secrets at the street corners. Inside, only fluorescent light and computer screens. Rachel felt a pang of envy for the anonymous people walking on the sidewalks, free to come and go without contracts to review. She stood and walked to the window. The view from the 13th floor was imposing, but brought her no comfort. On the contrary, it accentuated the gap between the life she had and the life she dreamed of. As she looked down, a memory of an old conversation with her father came to mind. The world isn't fair, but it respects those who know what they want. He always said that. She knew what she wanted, but the world didn't seem to care. That frustration burned more fiercely each day. She sighed and returned to her desk. She put away the papers with precise movements, trying to steady the slight tremor in her fingers. She knew she was near her limit, not physical exhaustion, but emotional. Something had to change. She needed to find a way out of that predictable routine, or she would become just another forgotten piece in an office that replaced employees like burned-out light bulbs. The phone rang, shattering the silence. She looked at the screen, an unknown number. She hesitated for a second before answering. On the other end, a male voice, firm and cordial, identified himself as an assistant to an important client. He didn't give a name, only asked to schedule a confidential meeting for the next day, at a location outside the office. The tone was polite but carried something enigmatic, almost imperative. "You come highly recommended," the voice said before hanging up, giving her no chance to ask questions. Rachel stayed for a few seconds with the phone in her hand, staring into nothing. A shiver ran down her neck. Highly recommended? By whom and for what? It wasn't common to receive invitations like that, especially from strangers. Her heart sped up, not from fear, but from a strange anticipation. This was what she had been waiting for all these years. A sign, an opening, an opportunity that could change her life. But something in the man's voice had sounded like a warning. She slipped the phone into her bag and looked out at the city through the window again. The lights outside seemed to shine differently, as if announcing that something was about to happen. She didn't yet know whether it was luck or trouble, but for the first time in months she felt awake. As she turned off the office lights and walked to the elevator, the feeling was clear. This night wouldn't end like the others. A silent and relentless destiny was already moving to place her face to face with an offer, capable of changing everything, and demanding a price she couldn't yet imagine. The metallic ring of the phone still echoed in Rachel's mind the next morning. The unknown voice that had spoken to her the night before remained a puzzle. Calm, firm, polite, yet carrying a weight that was hard to define. When she woke up, before even opening her eyes, she remembered the invitation to a confidential meeting and felt a wave of excitement mixed with apprehension. It was a new sensation, a kind of adrenaline that contrasted sharply with the monotony of her office days. She showered more slowly than usual, letting the water run down her shoulders as she tried to imagine who might be behind that call. The assistant had given no names, explained nothing, only asked her to appear at a specific address at 6 in the evening. The address, which she had scribbled quickly on a scrap of paper, wasn't any law office she knew. It was an old building in the city center, restored and transformed into a private venue for events. She had never been there but had heard rumors. Discreet halls, tall doors, silent corridors, a place for meetings where discretion was worth more than any contract. When choosing her clothes, she hesitated. What do you wear for a meeting when you don't know who will be present or what it's about? A black suit projected professionalism, but she feared it might look too cold. The navy blue dress, on the other hand, was elegant without being flashy. She chose that, adding a neutral coat and moderate heels. She looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection showed a woman who seemed more confident than she actually felt. A touch of understated lipstick completed the serious look. This was how she wanted to be seen, prepared but not vulnerable. At the office during the day, she did her best to focus on work, but every word of the contracts she reviewed seemed to slip away. The meeting circled her mind like a secret, pulling her attention off course. One of her co-workers gave her a strange look when he saw her smiling at her phone for no reason. She covered it up by burying herself behind a pile of documents. She didn't want questions or speculation. This opportunity, whatever it was, needed to be handled carefully. Throughout the afternoon, her thoughts swung between curiosity and caution. Who could be interested in her legal services? She wasn't a star of criminal law, wasn't a partner at a major firm, didn't have a famous last name, and yet someone had said she was highly recommended. The phrase echoed in her mind, sparking guesses. A satisfied former client? A forgotten contact? Or maybe a test for something bigger, a high-profile case. At 5:30, she shut down her computer and put away the papers with precise movements. It was early to leave the office, but today she didn't care. She called a car through an app, checked the address on the scrap of paper for the umpteenth time, and took a deep breath. As she descended in the elevator, her heart beat faster than usual. It wasn't exactly fear, but a dense expectation, like before walking into an important courtroom. Outside, the city was still bright, but the sky was starting to turn orange. Traffic crawled lazily along the avenues. In the car, Rachel watched the old facades mixed with modern buildings, the hurried people on the sidewalks, the street vendors shouting their offers. Everything seemed more alive, sharper. She thought about how a single phone call could shift the tone of an entire day. Even the noises seemed to carry meaning. When the vehicle stopped in front of the address, she saw an imposing building. Facade of light stone, tall dark wood doors, windows with tinted glass that hid the interior. On the discreet sign, only a generic name that meant nothing. The driver offered to open the door for her, but she thanked him and chose to go alone. She adjusted her coat, held her bag firmly, and walked toward the entrance. Each step sounded different on the marble pavement. It was like crossing an invisible boundary. Before entering, she drew a deep breath, catching a faint scent of a masculine perfume in the air, unsure whether it came from someone passing by or from the building itself. She pushed the heavy door and was greeted by a silent hall lit by antique chandeliers. The contrast with the street was immediate. Outside, noise and haste. Inside, calm and mystery. A receptionist in a discreet uniform approached, asking no names and no reasons. She only gave a neutral smile and asked Rachel to follow her. Rachel walked down a long corridor, lined with old paintings whose subjects she didn't recognize. Every detail seemed chosen to convey sobriety and confidentiality. The sound of her heels echoed alongside the woman's footsteps ahead, in an almost ritualistic rhythm. With each step, the feeling that she was entering something larger grew. It was as if she wasn't just walking into a building, but crossing a symbolic threshold, leaving behind the ordinary lawyer to become the protagonist of something unknown. They stopped in front of a dark wood door with no plaques, no identification. The receptionist gestured discreetly for Rachel to wait and went inside for a few seconds, closing the door behind her. Rachel stood alone in the corridor, studying the carved details on the frame, trying to control her nerves. She adjusted her dress, took another deep breath. She felt watched, though there was no one else there. A cold draft passed, raising goosebumps on her arms. When the door opened again, the receptionist simply said, "This way, please." Her voice was neutral but had something rehearsed about it, as if it were part of a protocol. Rachel inhaled deeply, lifted her chin, and took the first step inside, carrying with her a mixture of anxiety and determination. She didn't know what she would find on the other side, but for the first time in a long while, she felt she might be about to step into a setting capable of changing her life. The hall Rachel was led into was spacious, lit by soft lights that highlighted the shine of black marble on the floor. There were no windows, only heavy velvet curtains that absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere of confidence. In the center, a long dark wood table, polished until it reflected the chandelier above, awaited. At its far end a man sat, turned slightly to the side as if taking in and measuring the room before speaking. Rachel drew a deep breath, feeling her pulse in her neck. There was something about this space that didn't feel like a simple professional meeting. The elegance was only a layer. Beneath it lay a density hard to name. "Ms. Rachel," the male voice said, deep and controlled. "Please have a seat." She obeyed, moving to the chair opposite him. The man watched her with a focused gaze, as though assessing more than appearances. His dark hair was combed back, his suit was impeccable and clearly tailored, and his watch was discreet but obviously expensive. His presence was magnetic, not for obvious beauty but for the blend of calm and power. "Thank you for coming," he continued. "I imagine you're curious." Rachel nodded, keeping her tone professional. "Your assistant said there was a proposal." He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed." A younger man in a gray suit approached, placed a leather folder on the table, and withdrew without a word. The tycoon slid the folder toward Rachel. "Before I explain, I need to be sure that everything we discuss here stays between us," he said. "You're known for your discretion." Rachel opened the folder. Inside was a stack of documents sealed with discreet ribbons. But what caught her attention most was the contract value highlighted on the first pages. A multi-million-dollar sum, larger than anything she had ever seen in legal fees. Her heart sped up, but she kept her expression neutral. "I want you to defend my reputation," the man said, leaning slightly forward. "There are accusations against me, some old, some recent. None have been proven. I need someone who isn't tied to the interests of my competitors." Rachel flipped through a few pages, trying to take it in. The contract was straightforward. Legal consulting, strategic advising, representation in specific proceedings. But it named no accusers and gave no details of the alleged offenses, only clauses about absolute confidentiality, deadlines, and advance payment. "That's a lot of money for a service that doesn't even detail what the cases are," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "It isn't the money that should surprise you, Ms. Rachel, but the trust. I'm offering you something few would receive." She felt a shiver. For a moment she wanted to get up and leave, but something about the man, perhaps the mystery, perhaps the promise of power, kept her seated. "May I ask why me?" she ventured. "Because you have talent, but you're not part of the networks of favors that corrode our field," he replied. "And because you need an opportunity." Rachel stayed silent. It was as if he had read her thoughts from the night before. She tightened her fingers on the edge of the folder to hide her nervousness. He leaned back in his chair, hands crossed over his chest. "You don't have to decide now," he said quietly. "But every hour that passes is an hour less to act." The wall clock showed 6:45. The sound of the ticking filled the space between them. Rachel thought of the long nights of underpaid work, the closed doors she had faced. She also thought of the vague wording of the contract, the rumors she had heard about his name, rumors of shady dealings, of adversaries disappearing from the scene. "What exactly are you accused of?" she asked, trying to keep her tone professional. "Of everything and nothing," he answered with a half-smile. "Don't worry. I'm not asking you to commit a crime, only to defend me from accusations that don't hold up." She lowered her eyes to the papers. The number printed there seemed to glow on its own, a sum that would change not just her career but her life. With that money, she could open her own firm, gain independence. It was the chance she'd been waiting for. But at the same time, she felt something dark surround her, as if she were about to walk down a corridor without knowing what lay at the end. The tycoon pushed an elegant pen toward her. "When you're ready," he said simply. The silence in the hall was dense. Rachel took a deep breath. She knew this signature wasn't just a contract. It was a pact, a commitment that could elevate her or destroy her. Her hand hovered over the paper for a long moment. Then slowly she wrote her name in the indicated space. When she handed the pen back, the tycoon inclined his head in approval, but didn't smile. "Welcome to my world, Ms. Rachel," he said softly. Rachel felt a chill climb her spine. She clutched the folder to her chest, aware that she had just taken an irreversible step. She didn't know exactly what she was getting into, but for the first time in years, she felt the bittersweet taste of standing before something big, dangerous, and irresistible. The soft hum of the armored car's engine that had taken Rachel back to the office still echoed in her mind when, the next morning, she opened the folder for the first time. The contract she had signed the night before felt heavier than the paper suggested. Inside were also copies of lawsuits, newspaper clippings, audit reports, and a list of names. The smell of leather mixed with the scent of freshly printed paper, creating a sense of luxury and secrecy at the same time. She sat at her private desk, now installed on a reserved floor of the client's building. The space was different from her previous office. Walls lined with dark wood, heavy curtains, discreet and expensive furniture, place built for silence and discretion. An assistant of the tycoon had greeted her wordlessly, only with a nod, before leaving her alone. Everything there conveyed order and surveillance. Rachel spread the documents across the desk. At first glance, they looked like ordinary reports, company balance sheets, merger contracts, internal correspondence. But just a few minutes of reading were enough to see the numbers didn't add up. Transfers to offshore accounts, shell companies, excessively vague clauses. The accusations that didn't hold up, as the tycoon had said, seemed to have deeper roots than she had imagined. As she underlined sections with a pen, a sense of unease grew. This wasn't just a complex case. It was a maze of information carefully built to confuse. The names of influential people appeared discreetly in the attachments. Politicians, business leaders, retired judges. It was as if she had opened a door to a parallel world where power and money intertwined without rules. She lifted her eyes to the window. From where she sat, she could see only the building's internal courtyard, covered by a geometric garden. Two men in dark suits were talking quietly near the entrance. She had noticed those same faces in the hallway a few times, always still, like shadows. Were they security? Assistants? Or observers? Not knowing bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She forced herself back to the documents. The more she read, the stronger the feeling of being tested became. It was as if someone had left deliberate clues to see if she would find them. In one report, for instance, there was an entire blank page in the middle of an apparently simple contract. In the footer, a short phrase, "See confidential annex," but there was no annex. A mistake? A warning? Rachel made a side note, marking each irregularity. In the afternoon, a staff member knocked just to inform her lunch would be served in the room next door. He didn't ask to come in, didn't ask what she wanted. He spoke in a neutral tone, as if following a rigid protocol. When he left, Rachel realized she hadn't heard footsteps in the corridor before the knock. The isolation of the environment was starting to feel intentional. She returned to the papers. The large sums and coded names formed a mosaic that was slowly beginning to reveal a pattern. Not a full picture, but enough to tighten her stomach. She remembered the tycoon's words, I'm not asking you to commit a crime. That had sounded reassuring the night before. Now it sounded like a riddle. By the end of the day, she packed everything back into the leather folder and stood up. The office was silent, but she felt someone's presence beyond the walls. In the corridor, another man in a suit walked slowly past, speaking quietly on the phone. His eyes met hers for a second longer than normal. There was no hostility in the look, only a cold, professional vigilance. Rachel quickened her pace to the elevator. Inside the car taking her home, the reflection in the window showed her own tense face. She tried to relax her shoulders but couldn't. She wasn't exactly afraid, but she had a strange sense she had entered a game whose rules she didn't yet know. She remembered the first time she had stepped into an important courtroom, the same flutter in her stomach, the same urge to prove she was capable. At home later, she spread the papers out on her living room table and kept reading. The apartment's silence contrasted with the weight of those documents. Each number, each signature, each date seemed to carry a secret. And the more she deciphered, the clearer it became that this case was not just a professional opportunity, but a dividing line in her life. On one side, the ordinary attorney. On the other, a participant in something that extended far beyond the courts. She closed the folder late at night. The click of the metal clasp sounded like a warning. She stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street. A dark car was parked at the corner. It could be coincidence. It could be paranoia. But when the car's lights flicked on for a moment and then off again, a shiver ran down her arms. She slowly pulled the curtain shut. She took a deep breath, trying to recover her calm. The contract she had signed had given her access to a new world, but also seemed to have placed her under a magnifying glass. She didn't yet know how far this would go, but she was sure of one thing. She was not just representing a client. She was crossing into a territory where every step demanded double caution. The following days turned into a sequence of meetings that gradually reshaped Rachel's routine. Meetings that once happened during business hours began to be scheduled at dusk, stretching late into the night. The reserved office where she worked for the tycoon had developed its own rhythm, almost parallel to the outside world. Low lights, heavy doors, silent corridors. She arrived in the late afternoon, and by the time she left, the city was already wrapped in shadows. This shift seemed intentional, as if he wanted to move everything into a space where formality was no longer the only rule. At first, Rachel tried to keep a strictly professional posture. She sat at the table with her laptop open, the folder organized, pen ready to take notes. He, in turn, maintained a calm, objective tone, speaking of deadlines, strategies, and clauses. But there was something in his gestures, the way he leaned in to show her a document, the lingering look when she made a sharp observation, that didn't fit within the lines of a contract. Subtle but persistent signals created a silent tension in the air. One of the first nights, the meeting extended past 9. The assistant brought coffee and left, leaving the two of them alone. The ticking clock in the corner marked each minute like a slow metronome. Rachel felt the atmosphere shift, the air denser, the amber light casting elongated shadows on the wooden walls. He stood to close the curtain, and the simple act, holding the fabric, drawing it slowly, seemed loaded with meaning. When he returned to the table, the look he gave her was no longer merely that of a client to his attorney. It was a look that said more than words could. She lowered her eyes to the papers, trying to regain focus. But the hand holding the pen trembled slightly. Focus on the case, she told herself. Still, the memory of that look remained, like a scent that would not fade. Dinners began naturally, first to discuss documents outside the office, then as an unspoken routine, always in discreet restaurants, far from cameras and spotlights. The waiters seemed hand-picked, knowing him by name, bringing dishes and wines without his asking. In these settings, he kept the same polite tone, but lighter than in meetings. He asked about her life, how she had entered law, what her ambitions were. He listened with genuine attention, leaning slightly forward, elbows on the table as if nothing else in the room mattered. Rachel, in turn, answered carefully. She didn't want to reveal too much, but also didn't want to seem cold. She felt observed in a different way, not as a piece on a chessboard, but as someone whose value he was gradually discovering. When she spoke of her childhood or her first cases, he looked at her with a curiosity that blended admiration. and something harder to name. This attention, this space for her to speak of herself, was new. In courtrooms and offices, she was always the one listening, serving others' interests. Here, for the first time, she felt at the center of the frame. One night, after one of these dinners, he walked her to her car. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by tall lamps casting circles of light on the drizzle-wet ground. As they walked side by side, she felt the discreet warmth of his body even without touching. He opened the door for her with an unhurried gesture. For a moment, their fingers almost brushed. There was no contact, but the closeness made her heart beat faster. She thanked him softly, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. He only nodded, his eyes on her a second longer than necessary, then stepped back, letting her get in the car. In the days that followed, this silent tension only grew. During meetings, she noticed their dialogue slowing. Long pauses between sentences filled with looks and dense silence. Not uncomfortable silences, but charged with expectation, like the moment before a song begins. When he leaned to point out something in a document, he left his hand resting on the table near hers, not touching, but erasing distance. Sometimes, when passing her a report, his fingers brushed the paper she held, and that indirect touch was enough to keep her on alert. Rachel fought against this invisible growth. She repeated to herself that she was there to work, that there was a contract, that this was dangerous. But each time she remembered the signed sum, she also remembered his expression, the way his eyes darkened when he spoke of his problems, the way his voice dropped when confiding case details. He was a powerful man, used to controlling everything, and yet there were moments when he seemed vulnerable before her. That vulnerability, rare and unexpected, broke through her defenses. One night he invited her to a meeting at his apartment, claiming he needed privacy to handle a delicate document. It was an elegant but not ostentatious space. Exposed concrete walls, sober furniture, abstract paintings, a fire burned, and the soft warmth mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. They sat opposite each other in low armchairs, papers between them. The setting was intimate but not too intimate. There was still distance, still professionalism, but the environment, the low light, the distant sound of the city through the window, made it impossible to ignore the tension. As he explained a clause, he leaned in to show her a passage and, for a moment, his hand lightly touched her arm, almost involuntarily. Rachel felt a shiver rise along her skin. He withdrew his hand immediately, apologizing in a neutral tone, but his eyes said something else. She lowered her gaze to the papers, trying to catch her breath as her heart sped up. They didn't speak of that moment afterward, but from then on the meetings carried a clear subtext, even if never named. There were no declarations, no explicit gestures, but each prolonged look, each pause in conversation, each accidental touch was like a thread weaving between them. A thin, almost invisible thread, but strong. Rachel began to prepare more carefully for meetings. She chose clothes that made her feel confident, discreet perfume, a hairstyle that kept her professional, yet enhanced her presence. It wasn't a conscious strategy. It was a reflection of what she was beginning to feel. At the same time, she doubled down on keeping her work clear, taking notes, avoiding any behavior that could seem improper. It was a silent war between the attorney and the woman inside her. And so, the daily coexistence became an ambiguous terrain where contracts and confidences coexisted, with lingering looks and silences heavy with meaning. Each night seemed to draw them closer, without a single explicit step taken. It was a game of tension and restraint, an emotional labyrinth where both walked carefully, aware that a single misstep could change everything: the case, their reputations, and perhaps their own lives. The first signs were subtle. A car parked across the street, always in the same spot with tinted windows. A man standing in the building's lobby, apparently waiting for someone, who disappeared when she returned from work. At first, Rachel thought it was coincidence. It was common, she told herself, for a high-profile case to draw curious eyes. But as days passed, coincidence stopped feeling like an explanation. On a gray Tuesday morning, she found an unmarked envelope on her car's windshield. Inside, only a sheet folded in 4 with a printed sentence: "Be careful who you trust." No logo, no signature, just those words in capital letters. The paper smelled of fresh ink, as if it had been printed only hours before. Rachel looked around, but the street was empty. She folded the paper back with trembling hands and got into the car. During the drive, the sentence echoed in her head like a persistent whisper. Arriving at the reserved office, she locked the door behind her and opened the case folder. She tried to dive into the documents but couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. The window's reflection showed only her own face, but she had the impression that, outside, someone might be looking in. The contract she had signed, with its millions and complex clauses, now seemed like a ticket into a world where every step was monitored. In the afternoon, she received a text message. "Unknown number." The phrase was short. "Not everything is what it seems. No context, no name." She took a deep breath, deleted the message, and tried to convince herself it was a prank. But when half an hour later, another message arrived. "You don't know who you're dealing with." A shiver ran up her spine. Her heart sped up, and for a moment she thought about calling him, telling him what was happening. But she hesitated. Part of her feared seeming weak. Another part feared something else that he already knew. The meetings continued. The tycoon kept the same elegant posture, the same controlled tone. On the nights they met to discuss the case, he seemed genuinely interested in protecting her, asking if she was all right, if she needed security. But there were moments when his eyes darkened, as if hiding something. Rachel tried to read behind his expression, but it was like staring at a polished marble wall. Nothing leaked out. This ambiguity tore at her. When they were together, in meetings or dinners, she felt the same growing attraction, that silent tension that had become almost familiar. But alone at night, with anonymous messages arriving and strange noises in the hallway, she felt manipulated, like a piece in a bigger game. She wondered if he was truly on her side or if he was the very maestro of the danger now surrounding her. One night, arriving at her apartment, she found the door ajar. She was sure she had locked it when leaving. Her heart raced. She pushed it open slowly, turning on the light. Everything seemed in place, but on the living room table, there was another envelope, identical to the one from her car. Inside, a new message. "The contract has a price. Are you willing to pay?" She could no longer pretend it was chance. Someone was entering her space, violating her daily life. She sat on the sofa, fingers crushing the paper. Her breathing quickened. She thought of calling the police, but how to explain? There were no explicit threats, only vague phrases. Besides, the contract with the tycoon required absolute confidentiality. Any exposure could compromise the case. She felt cornered, as if each choice drew her deeper into a labyrinth. In the following days, she began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. A different driver in the car that picked her up. A new face among the building's security guards. A silent phone call that disconnected as soon as she answered. Small cracks in her routine that, together, formed a disturbing picture. She started avoiding obvious routes, changing cabs instead of using her car, looking over her shoulder while walking. But even amid this growing fear, she couldn't pull away from him. Each time she met him, each time she felt the discreet warmth of his presence, part of her relaxed. He seemed the only person able to offer answers, or at least pretend to protect her. This duality confused her. Fear and desire intertwined like strands of the same rope. Sometimes, watching him leaf through a document with his usual calm, she wondered if that serenity was just a mask. One particularly tense night, during a meeting at her apartment, she couldn't hold back and mentioned the anonymous messages. He raised his eyebrows, looked at her intently, then set his pen on the table. The silence lasted a few seconds, enough for her to feel the weight of his gaze. Finally, he said in a grave tone, "I'll take care of it, nothing else." No explanation, no questions. Just that sentence. To Rachel, it sounded as much like comfort as it did a warning. After he left, she remained alone in the room, lit only by the streetlight. She ran her fingers over the paper of the messages and felt a chill up her arms. It was impossible to deny that since she had signed that contract, her life had become more dangerous. The millions now seemed a gilded trap, and with each passing day, it became harder to know if he was her ally or her executioner. That night, she took a long time to fall asleep. Lying in bed, she replayed every detail of the past weeks. The dinners, the looks, the subtle touches. She thought of the messages, the car parked at the corner, the ajar door, And above all, she thought of him, the man who could destroy her or save her, a man who awakened something in her she hadn't felt in years, but who also dragged her into dangerous territory. As sleep eluded her, a single question spun in her mind, incessant. Am I being protected or manipulated? And that question frightened her more than any anonymous message. The private office was silent that night. The clock showed nearly 10, but Rachel remained seated at the desk covered with papers. The curtains were drawn, sealing the space off from the world outside. The folder she had received that afternoon looked ordinary. Just another batch of contracts, reports, internal correspondence. But as soon as she opened the documents, she felt something she couldn't explain. There was something here that wasn't meant to be seen, as if someone had hidden a missing puzzle piece in the middle of routine material. She began leafing slowly, page by page, like someone searching for a needle in a haystack. First came investment spreadsheets, then letters from foreign lawyers, everything seemingly legitimate, until in one of the last pages she found a faded seal, an old stamp. The company name mentioned there appeared in no current record. It was an entity dissolved more than a decade ago, tied to import activities on the coast. The numbers and dates didn't match. Rachel frowned. This was the sort of detail cautious lawyers erase, not keep. She pulled out her laptop, connected to public databases, and began cross-checking information. The name of that ghost company popped up in old lawsuits closed without convictions. Maritime shipping contracts, invoices for vanished cargo, bank transfers to tax havens. And in one of the reports she was analyzing, there was the magnate's signature. Much younger, but unmistakable. A cold shiver ran down her spine. It was as if a hidden map had suddenly been revealed. She kept digging. She discovered that the company didn't operate alone. It was part of a business network including politicians, energy sector entrepreneurs, retired judges. Well-known names appeared discreetly in the documents, names that, if leaked, would make national headlines. What she held in her hands wasn't just a reputation defense case. It was a file on past crimes, buried under layers of shell companies and carefully drafted contracts. Rachel leaned back in her chair, breathing deeply. The room felt colder. She remembered every conversation she had had with the magnate, his promises that nothing illegal was involved. His calm, convincing voice now echoed with another meaning. I'm not asking you to commit a crime. That was the phrase. But what if he had only been using her to protect an old secret, larger than everything? She reached for her phone to photograph the document, but stopped. The contract she had signed included severe confidentiality clauses. Any leak could destroy her career, perhaps even put her at physical risk. Her hands began to sweat. She put the phone back in her pocket. For a few seconds, she just stared at the paper, unable to decide what to do. A memory came unbidden. The first time she saw him. The steady gaze, the discreet charm, the feeling of being in front of someone who controlled everything. That image began to crumble now. Behind the charisma lay a past built on murky foundations. She didn't yet know the details, but she knew enough to understand that his fortune wasn't just the fruit of clever deals. There was something darker. Something involving crimes never tried and people too powerful to fall. She flipped through the documents again. She found handwritten notes in the margins, made by someone who knew the case from the inside. They were short comments, sometimes ironic, sometimes cynical. This contract saved us. Payment confirmed. Keep out of official records. The words seemed to whisper entire stories. Rachel ran her fingers over the ink, as if she could feel the voices of those who had signed their own impunity. A footstep in the hallway made her heart race. She closed the folder quickly and looked at the door. Silence. She walked to the doorknob and opened it slowly. No one. Only the empty corridor and the distant echo of the elevator. She went back inside, locked the door. She realized she had been holding her breath. She sat down again but couldn't concentrate anymore. The weight of the discovery was heavier than the paper could hold. The next day, when she met the magnate for another meeting, she couldn't hide her unease. He spoke in the same calm tone, giving instructions about legal strategies. But she noticed every gesture, every pause. She wondered if he knew she had found out. Their eyes crossed more than once, and in those moments she had the impression there was something in his gaze, Not just power, but calculation. A look measuring her reactions, assessing her loyalty. As he explained a clause, her heart beat faster. Every word he spoke seemed to carry a subtext. Are you with me or against me? It was as if an invisible wall had risen between them. The charm of discreet dinners and lingering glances now felt tainted by a shadow. There was still attraction, yes, but mixed with a distrust she could no longer ignore. That night, at home, she opened the documents again. This time she read each page as if examining a trap. The silent romance building between them gave way to a maze of questions. Who really was this man? What were the secrets he was so desperate to protect? And above all, how far was she willing to go to keep her place in this story? She locked the papers in a folder and turned off the light. The room sank into darkness. The street's reflection on the windows seemed farther away than ever. A chill ran over her skin. She realized now, with painful clarity, that the contract she had signed wasn't just a job. It was a pact. And every pact has a price she was beginning to understand too late. The apartment was dimly lit. Heavy curtains filtered the city's glow, and the fire in the hearth cast dancing flickers on the walls. Rachel waited, standing by the window, feeling the cold glass against her palm. She had asked him for a talk, but now, about to face him, she felt her heart pound. With every beat, she remembered the documents she had found, the anonymous messages, the car parked on the corner. And she remembered too every look, every gesture that had brought them closer. When the door opened, the air seemed to change density. He walked in slowly, closing it behind him, and stood still for a few seconds, watching her. The silence was thick, as if every sound were suspended. Finally, he walked to the table, dropped his leather folder, and said in a calm but tense tone, "You asked to see me." Rachel turned. The firelight etched shadows on his face. She took a deep breath to steady her voice. "I need to understand what game I'm in." Her eyes stayed fixed on his. Documents, ghost companies, powerful names. "You told me nothing illegal was happening. I deserve the truth." He didn't answer at once. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare, almost nervous gesture. He walked to the bookshelf, touched a book without really looking at it. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "The truth isn't simple, Rachel." She stepped closer. "I'm not a piece on your chessboard. If you want me to stay, I need to know what I'm involved in." He looked at her, his eyes darkened by the firelight. "I never wanted you to find out this way." A pause. "And I never wanted to put you in danger." There was sincerity there, but also something she couldn't decipher. She moved one step nearer. "Then tell me." Her voice came out almost a whisper. He took a deep breath and began. "In the beginning, yes, there were shady deals. I was young, ambitious, and the world doesn't forgive hesitation. That network you found, it didn't start with me, but I profited from it. Later I tried to clean everything up, but some ties don't break." He held her gaze. "Today I'm more of a prisoner of it than you imagine." The words fell between them like stones in water. Rachel felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and an inexplicable relief at finally hearing something concrete. The room seemed smaller. "And me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Am I just another instrument?" He came closer, stopped less than a meter from her, their shadows mingling on the floor. "No." His tone was almost a whisper. "You're the first person in a long time who hasn't treated me as a monster or an idol. He hesitated. "I didn't expect to feel anything for you." The confession hung in the air. Rachel's heart pounded. There was danger here, but also a vulnerability she had never imagined in him. A long silence wrapped them. She felt the warmth of the fire mixed with the warmth of his body, so near. She could hear his breath, slow, restrained. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said at last. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," he replied. Her eyes searched his for answers. For an instant, tension became something else, a magnetic field between them, made of attraction and fear. He raised his hand slowly, as if afraid of a sudden move, and lightly touched her arm with his fingertips. An almost non-existent touch, but it sparked a shiver on her skin. She didn't move away. The touch slid up her forearm to her shoulder, still restrained, as if he were asking permission at every inch. The air between them grew warmer. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. The scene felt dizzying. The man who was at once her client, her risk and her temptation now so close. "This isn't right," she murmured. But her voice lacked firmness. "I know," he said, his breath heavier. "But it's real." For an instant they stood there, motionless, the fire crackling behind them. The world reduced to two bodies, separated only by a decision. He didn't pull her to him. He just kept his hand on her shoulder, his thumb drawing a slow circle, almost reverent, like writing a secret on her skin. The gesture was intimate but still restrained, like an unspoken promise. Rachel opened her eyes. She found his and saw in them not just desire but also a silent plea. A plea for trust, perhaps for absolution. It was a look that mixed everything: power, guilt, passion. Her throat went dry. Her heart beat so loud it seemed to fill the room. She stepped back, breaking the touch. The air moved again between them. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to understand what all this means." He lowered his hand, nodding slowly. He didn't try to stop her. "I understand." His tone was grave but with a trace of pain. "I never wanted to drag you into my darkness." Rachel picked up her bag, keeping her eyes on him. She knew that despite the distance, something had changed forever in that moment. She left not only with secrets, but with a piece of that man's soul stuck to hers. At the door, before leaving, she turned one last time. He still stood by the fire, the light outlining his silhouette. A man divided between power and guilt, between confession and desire. A man who drew her and frightened her at the same time. "I don't know if I can trust you," she repeated. I hope someday you'll find out," he said, his voice sounding like an echo of something that wouldn't end there. Rachel left, closing the door softly. The corridor was cold, silent. Each step she took felt heavier than the one before. Inside her, attraction and fear remained tangled, an impossible knot to undo. She knew that confrontation hadn't been only about secrets. It had also been about the risk of losing herself in something bigger than both of them. And as she walked to the elevator, she felt that his confession wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new shadow between them. The following days were a labyrinth for Rachel. Hours dragged, each carrying a silent weight. She neither returned to the magnate's office nor answered his calls. In her apartment, the drawn curtains created a permanent twilight. The city outside ran at a frantic pace, but inside time seemed suspended. Spread across the table like cards in a dangerous game were the copies of the documents she had uncovered. Contracts, names, amounts, dates. Each sheet was a potential choice: justice or silence, loyalty or self-preservation. Looking at them tightened her chest. Turning everything over to the authorities would destroy a powerful man's career, maybe save other people, but it would also mean betraying someone who somehow had touched something deep inside her. Lately she dreamed of him, dreams where the two of them walked down dark corridors chased by shadows. Dreams where a warm hand held hers but vanished the instant she tried to grasp it. She woke with her heart racing and a mixture of fear and longing. A week passed like this, a week of silence, until one rainy night she heard heavy knocks on the door. Her heart raced. Through the slit of the curtain she saw a car parked, headlights off. She approached the door, hesitant. "Rachel!" His muffled but unmistakable voice came. She opened slowly. He was there, soaked, the dark overcoat clinging to his body, his eyes intense. He didn't look like the magnate from the expensive dinners. He looked like an ordinary man, vulnerable, anxious. "I couldn't stand not seeing you anymore," he said, his breath uneven. "You left me in the dark, and I don't know if you're going to destroy me or save me." Rachel stepped aside and he entered. The room was in half-light, lit only by the lamp in the corner. Rain drummed on the glass like a slow tambourine. He stopped in the middle of the room, his shoulders still tense. She closed the door, heart pounding. "I needed to think," she said quietly. "I have to decide whether to trust you, or do what's right. And what's right for you?" he asked, taking a step closer. "What's right for us?" Rachel felt the weight of the words. She wanted to say there was no us, that everything was a mistake, but she couldn't. He was so close now she could smell the rain mixed with his cologne. His eyes searched hers with almost painful intensity. "I can't choose for you," he said, lower now, almost a sigh. "But I needed to see you. I needed to remember this is real." For a moment the silence filled the room. She felt each beat of her heart, the electric tension in the air. He lifted his hand slowly, as he had before, and touched a strand of wet hair that had slipped from her bun. The gesture was simple but loaded with meaning. She closed her eyes, a wave of heat running through her. "You confuse me," she whispered. "I should hate you." "Then hate me," he answered, rough-voiced. "But don't ignore me." His touch slid down the side of her face, tracing her jaw. Rachel opened her eyes. The distance between them shrank until she could feel the warmth of his body, his breath contrasting with the chill of the rain. The tension turned into something deeper, inevitable. She didn't know who moved first. Their lips met in a contained but intense kiss, like a secret shared. There was no rush, only a silent recognition. The room disappeared, the documents disappeared. Only that suspended instant remained, made of desire and fear, surrender and restraint. He held her arms, firm but gentle, as if holding something precious and fragile. The kiss deepened, respectful but charged with everything they couldn't say. Rachel felt his hand slide slowly up her back, almost reverent. There was nothing explicit, more a touch of promise than possession. She answered him, her heart beating as if it would burst. She was torn between the need to push him away and the desire to stay. For a moment she pressed her forehead to his, eyes closed, breathing together, sharing the same air. "This is wrong," she murmured. "Then don't say anything," he replied softly, his thumb caressing the nape of her neck. "Just stay here with me." They embraced, a long, dense hug that held anger, guilt, longing, and desire, a hug that was almost a silent pact. For an instant, Rachel let her head fall on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, his heart beating fast. So human. She didn't know if this was forgiveness, goodbye, or one last mistake. She only knew that, in that instant, the world outside disappeared, and the line between right and wrong blurred like watercolor washed by rain. When they finally drew apart, still too close, he looked into her eyes. "I can't promise a clean future," he said seriously. "But I can promise I won't leave you alone." Rachel swallowed hard, her heart tight. The dilemma hadn't disappeared. It had deepened. But deep down she knew that, whatever her decision, nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the rain thickened, as if the whole world shared the same tension. Inside the apartment, they stood in silence, breathing together, a step from the abyss, a step only Rachel could decide to take. Dawn seeped slowly through the apartment window. The sky was still gray, tinged with pale blue. The room smelled of rain, cold coffee, and something else, a trace of recent closeness. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, knees drawn up, head in her hands. On the other side of the room, he was buttoning his shirt. The scene had a quiet, almost cinematic quality. Two characters after a moment of surrender, now separated by the heavy silence of reality. He glanced at her, dark eyes tired, as if already sensing the words to come. "I need time," she said finally, her voice low. "I need to understand what to do with all this." His gesture was restrained, just a nod. He didn't insist, didn't argue. He only met her gaze one last time before taking his coat. "I understand," he murmured. "I'll wait." Rachel felt her chest tighten as she watched him leave. The door clicked softly, but to her it sounded like thunder. She stood still for a few minutes, the distant sound of the elevator sinking down the shaft. The apartment seemed larger now, but also colder. She walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. Her hands trembled. On the table still lay the documents she had examined so many times, papers that seemed to stare back at her, demanding a decision. She felt divided between two worlds, the principled lawyer and the woman who, for the first time, had allowed herself to feel something true and dangerous. The phone vibrated on the table, interrupting her thoughts. A notification with no sender, just an unknown number. She opened it hesitantly. The message was short, dry, unsigned. "Stay out of what you don't understand. Think of your family." Her heart raced. She read it again and again, fingers cold around the phone. It wasn't a vague warning. It was a direct threat. Images of her parents and brother flashed through her mind. Her stomach turned. This was no longer an intellectual courtroom game. It was a web of power and violence that could strike where it hurt most. Rachel took a deep breath, leaning against the wall. A solitary tear rolled down her face without her noticing. For the first time in a long time, she felt real fear, not just for herself, but for others. The moral dilemma she had been carrying now had a physical, concrete weight. What am I doing? She thought. She spent the rest of the day pacing the apartment like a shadow. She picked up one document, dropped another. Tried to eat, couldn't. She remembered his touch, the warmth of his arms, the confession by the fire. She remembered the vulnerable look so far from his public image. And yet there was blood and dirty money in that empire. And now there were threats. That night she sat at her computer. Slowly she typed an encrypted email to a trusted contact in the prosecutor's office. She didn't attach everything at once. She only signaled that she had evidence on financial schemes and names. Her heart pounded like a drum with each click. It was like signing a sentence. She didn't know if his or hers, but she had to protect her family. She had to somehow save herself. When she finished, she erased traces, turned off the device, and sat in the dark, looking at her own reflection in the window. The face looked different, older, more tired, more resolved. "Forgive me," she whispered into the empty room, not knowing whether she spoke to him or to herself. Weeks later, her life became a sequence of calculated steps. She moved to a new apartment, sold her car, asked for a transfer to another branch office. She created a discreet social media profile. It was as if she were erasing her existence and redrawing a new one. In the newspaper, she followed the scandal from afar. Companies under investigation. Accounts frozen, headlines about the magnate. Her name wasn't mentioned, but she knew that somehow she was at the center of it. Sometimes she dreamed of him, dreams where he appeared with his back turned on a foggy pier, and she tried to call him, but no sound came out. She woke with an emptiness in her chest, a longing she didn't want to admit. Starting over was necessary, but didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean stopping loving. The years passed like pages turned carefully. Rachel built a new routine, new friends, a new office. She became a partner in a small law group specializing in environmental defense. In other people's eyes, she was a successful, independent woman. But at night, when she closed the door, there was still a corner of her heart occupied by unspoken memories. One winter evening coming home, she found an envelope on the floor, slid under the door. Thick paper, no sender. Her heart jumped. She picked it up with trembling hands, feeling its symbolic weight before even opening it. She sat at the table, took a deep breath, and broke the seal. The handwriting was his. She would recognize it anywhere. Firm, slanted, elegant. The text began without formalities. "Rachel, I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I have to try. I know what you did. I know why you did it. I don't blame you. I understand. I'm not innocent. I'm not only guilty either. I'm a man who built an empire with dirty hands and tried to clean them too late. You saw me whole, what no one else saw. And still you stayed for a while. I miss you every day. I don't regret what I felt for you, nor what you did. Maybe it was the only right choice. Wherever you are, I hope you're safe. With love, despite everything." Rachel finished reading with misty eyes. Her hand trembled but didn't let go of the letter. Each sentence was a blade and a balm at the same time. There was no return address, no sign of where he was. Whether free or imprisoned, still powerful, or just a man running from ghosts. She stood, walked to the window. Outside, the city she had learned to call home kept its indifferent rhythm. In her chest, time seemed to have stopped. She ran her fingers over her lips as if she could feel an echo of old kisses. She thought of what they could have been, what they had chosen, what they had lost. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer among personal documents. She stared at the closed drawer as if it were a reliquary. Maybe one day she would answer. Maybe not. Maybe he wasn't even alive anymore. But the certainty that he understood, that he didn't hate her, was an unexpected comfort. She pressed her forehead to the cold window glass. The city lit up with the first lights of night. In the reflection, she saw a woman different from the one at the start. Stronger, sadder, more real. And despite everything, she felt a part of herself still bound to the man of shadows. A cold wind slipped through the gap. Rachel closed her eyes. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. They weren't of regret or relief. They were of something nameless. A mourning for what would never be. A love surviving even distance and time. The phone vibrated on the table, breaking the moment. It was only a trivial notification, but she didn't move. She stayed there, motionless, listening to her own heartbeat. Somewhere in the world, Perhaps at that very moment he too might be thinking of her. She opened her eyes, wiped her face, and smiled faintly, a smile that was at once farewell and remembrance. She didn't know what the future would bring, nor if they would ever cross paths again, but she knew that whatever happened, that story would never be completely over. And so she stood, gazing at the city's gray horizon, with the letter against her chest, and her heart suspended between the past and the unknown. The end, or perhaps only an interval, of something that would always have the bittersweet taste of impossible choices.